Previously, in Hedge Knights, the squires realized as their food stocks dwindled, they had to resort to hunting and eating fungus to survive the winter. They asked Arelco to hunt on their behalf and converted all the arable land to heated and enclosed nutrifungus farms. The bison were allowed to briefly graze the ripthorn to stretch food even further. Tangier and Lazarus are expecting. Judea arranged the keep to accommodate their swelling numbers and to make it feel more lived in. The squires repelled yet another war party that coincided with a new wave of acidic smog that threatened to repollute the keep and farms. Episode 8: Fungus Festival. As the members of the Bison Glade slept, racked with worry about war, famine, and hunger, little Madsy dreamt of green meadows and verdant trees. Children have a sense of wonder and imagination that gets chipped away by the toils of life as they age. The squires know this all too well. In her dream, she's chasing a young bison through fields of hay and wheat, calling her pet Tralalero. She found a name that suited the youngest calf. She'd let the others know in the morning. Megahoof's dreams, on the other hand, are all of duty and industry. He dreamt of traditions of home, and he had realized he had overlooked one of the simplest ways to feed his pack. Back home, farmers would use axes to maximize the yield of fungus and to make the work go more swiftly. In the morning, he'd work on understanding the schematics to show Lazarus how to replicate the designs. Pollution crept in through doors, arrow loops, and even through the dense granite and slate keep walls, threatening to evict the scrappy adlets. Not only did they have to defend against the onslaught of visitors, but even the winds themselves could kill. Sapo's next fermentation experiment was coming to an end, and if all went well, they'd have ales to lift their spirits. Someday, Sapo hoped to become a master brewer and to open a pub in a bustling community, bringing joy and merriment to all. His experiments brought much delight to his keepmates, and he hoped to carve out some land for permanent trellises of grapes and hops. Stocks of fungus ran out, and the two adlet farmers planned to harvest the tree farm early. The tree farm was most affected by the pollution, and they worried the crop would become tainted and die. Soon the main farm would be fully grown, but until then, they would have to harvest prematurely. Sapo was horrified by how much of the farm was overtaken by the pollution. Almost a third of the tree farm was enshrouded by blight. The painstaking efforts the adlets took to clean the topsoils was ruined so quickly by the cyclical smog. Sapo quickly inspected the bison for toxicity buildup as a result of grazing for ripthorn. He assessed that the bison could endure the pollution for a little longer. Looking after roaming bison was exhausting. Tracking them down to make sure they didn't wander off required time, and time wasn't something in great supply for the overworked adlets. The smog had lifted. The smog cleared, which means the careful work of removing polluted topsoil would continue. The pollution was quite pervasive in parts of the keep and the tree farm alike. Madsy would have to move her bed at least temporarily to keep her safe from the pollution that encroached through the arrow loops and doors. Judea and Tangier planned to continue tilling the Nutrifungus farms as there were no other, more pressing matters to attend to. Tilling in the dark was time-consuming, but the adlets needed the fields to be as productive as possible. Tangier mined the last node of coal from the hillside and felt a sense of accomplishment that she had supplied her friends and family with such an overabundance of coal they'd had to set up a special area just to deal with the excess. She couldn't wait to see what her partner Lazarus would make with the coal and iron. Having studied the schematics for fungal harvesting tools, Megahoof requested his fiancée construct an anvil so that Lazarus could forge some new equipment. The bison were looking a little ragged. They'll need some respite from the blight. Once the blades were done, they would harvest some of the Nutrifungus early. Megahoof woke at midnight under the full moon, an unusual hour for him to be up. He decided to take advantage of the serene keep and continued to study the books, schematics, and tomes that they had brought on their journey. He enjoyed sitting next to the crackling hearth with old tomes of progress and diagrams, knowing he was uniquely suited to make use of them. Someday he had hoped he could pass the knowledge down to Bash and other members of the coastal community who had lost their way with stagnation and complacency. He knew the books could answer many of their questions, but some questions he would have to discover answers for himself, like how to better use the strange purifying trees. Now that the anvil had been built by Judea, Lazarus planned on making those axes to make the work a little bit easier. They would need to harvest some of the Nutrifungus soon, as hunger gripped both the adlets and the bison. The northern section of the main farm was set to be harvested prematurely to fill the rumbling stomachs of both adlets and bison. Megahoof and Judea agreed to tie the knot today after having survived a dark and harsh winter. To bring a little levity to the occasion, someone let Lily loose into the keep. The adlets were so busy laughing at the situation that nobody could bring themselves to rope her back to the pen. She stomped through the bedrooms, ate mushroom soup, and then wandered into the fungal fields. Finally, a Relko led her back to the pen so the procession could start. The two adlets shared their private vows in a hearthroom filled with pollution and bison dung. Judea pulled down Megahoof's face mask as if it was a bridal veil. Sapo laughed so hard he nearly knocked over the cask of ale. Madzi wandered in late to the party. She had never been to a wedding before, and was clearly very confused why everyone was celebrating. The adlets realized how tough of a childhood she had, and that brought them to think about the sort of lives that Bash and future children of the squires would have. Their ceremony ended, and everyone in the tiny foothold keep either returned to their chores dutifully or rested early to build up the energy to conquer tomorrow. All of Lazarus and Sapo's careful management of the crop fields were about to pay off. The polluted fungus was slated to be cut early, but soon the adlets would have a horde of mushrooms, the like they had never seen before. Soon, there would be abundant fungus for all. The bison would be offered as much as they could eat while sheltered in their little barn. The stash kept outside of the keep to feed the local wildlife would be restocked too, partially as an apology for having to hunt for meat to survive the winter. The adlets had promised to build a future where even the wildlife would be protected, and they intended to keep that promise. Arauco and Madzi worked diligently to clean the pollution from the keep's grounds. Judea brought Fungus in to the bison, and they devoured it like a swarm of locusts. They had gone so long without food. Lazarus spotted the first of the wildlife to return to the bison glade. The amount of coal excavated from the southern hillside was easily enough to last another winter. Tangier would move on to building up a stockpile of raw iron as well. Judea tilled the keep's plots in amazement. The amount of fungus that Lazarus and Sappho had nurtured through the winter was more than tenfold than she had ever seen. It was unfortunate that they lived so far from the coast. Offering the excess to their family and friends back home would be a very generous gesture. She made a mental note to herself to inquire with Megahoov if trade with the coast was possible. Having spent the last few days removing pollution from the keep's western wall, Aurelco swept up the remaining dust and fur from the warm and worn stone and timber floor. Without the rolling smog and bison, his old home was far easier to maintain. He didn't quite understand why the squires had such veneration for the bison. There was still much he had to learn of their ways. Lazarus planned to make one more tool to help clean the bison glade. The old battleground just west of their main gate was a grim sight that needed to be cleared. He knew of just the tool to forge to make the task a lot easier. The last of the creeping pollution was being swept from the battlement arrow loops. Aurelco and Madzi took bets on how long the next smog rolled back in. Lazarus had forged a breach axe, specially designed to break down debris and wreckage. The axe was the perfect tool to aid for clearing the blighted battlefield. Now that the Atlets had ample food, Lazarus would take a little time out of his day to test out the newly forged tool. Maybe if he was lucky, he'd even find long-lost treasure amongst the dead and debris. The tool was perfect. He swept through the old battleground, clearing ancient boxes, crates, and other detritus with ease. Clearing the field was the first step in an extensive process of reclaiming the land. Lazarus knew there was a long road ahead of him and many battles to come. The decayed bones of ancient knights, standing as a failed bulwark against the onslaught of visitors, was a savage reminder of what the squires of the Bison Glade might be up against. This was very cathartic for Lazarus. Additionally, some of the old weapons could be smelted down and turned back into something useful. Metallic pieces of rusted weapons and armor were set into ingot molds after being cleaned. No ounce of metal would be wasted. The majority of the main keep farmland had been tilled and was ready for future plantings. Unfortunately, the ambrosia had withered and died in the darkened shade of the fungal fields. Judea really enjoyed ambrosia, and she hoped more of the bushy sprouts would crop up soon. A few ounces of steel had been recovered from the old weapons of the western battlefield. Unfortunately, Megahoof didn't have any schematics about producing steel, so the few ounces they had recovered couldn't be of any use for weapons or armor, and it was very unlikely that Megahoof or Lazarus would be able to reverse engineer such a trifling amount. The keep's main farm fields were ready for a full harvest. Madzi had spent days shadowing members of the Bison Keep. She found Megahoof's dusty tomes to be boring. She lacked the spatial skills to construct sturdy walls like Judea. She was fascinated by Sapo's skills in medicine and how he could save his friends from dying, and also how tough Lazarus was, able to stand his ground and defend against hordes of bloodthirsty visitors. She idolized them and would fashion herself in their image. The walls of the keep violently shook. Tangier rushed outside, searching for the catapult or trebuchet responsible, and was pleasantly confused that a new giant boulder of a strange black metal had clearly impacted just west of the gate instead. She yelled to the others that the coast was clear. Judea, Bash, and Madzi all succumbed to a painful stomachache, and the likely cause was the smogged harvest of fungus. The Atlas had to choose between starving or eating potentially blighted crops, and the blighted crops was the preferred choice. Sapo worried about Bash's health. Infants were more affected by intestinal illnesses. Many sleepless nights were ahead for Megahoof, Judea, Sapo, and Madzi. Sapo suggested Judea construct some better lighting for the bedrooms to help him tend their maladies. She set about constructing some nicer lighting in the morning. A refugee called out for help from the northern hills. He announced he was from a mountain community and needed shelter. Nobody heard his initial calls through the thick keep walls, so he approached the main gate. Arelco heard him approach and initially thought it was a midnight visitor raid, but when he realized it was just another refugee much like himself, he told him he was welcome to enter. He was in rough shape, clearly had wandered from afar, and was in need of rest, new clothes, and shelter. Arelco told the stranger that he too was a refugee and he had only recently joined. He told him to help himself to clothes from the shelves and a hot meal from the kitchen. Most of the other adlets were sleeping, but he said their group were not the sort to turn refugees down, and would formally welcome him in the morning. The noise woke Megahoof, but in his sleepy stupor, he didn't even realize they had offered shelter to a new refugee, as he wandered off to the tree farm with coal in hand to stoke the hearth. Arelco told Megahoof that he offered shelter to another refugee, and Megahoof thought it was a great idea to celebrate the refugee's arrival. He had planned to celebrate the spring equinox, but framing it as a celebration of a refugee's survival would lift spirits even further. The new member asked how he could earn the new clothes he wore and the food he ate, and the others told him just to check in with various members working around the bison glade. He didn't have a lot of experience in a particular trade, but was eager to chip in and not be seen as a burden. Some additional clothing was tailored to accommodate their newest member. He was fascinated by the strange designs of the tree farm. He had never seen fungus grow, especially not in the pitch-black darkness of an enclosed farm. He wondered about the importance of the central tree. Everything about this community was so utterly foreign to him, but they were clearly thriving in a land of death and blight. He knew he had much to learn. Megahoof gathered the community to celebrate the spring equinox and the arrival of the latest refugee. Judea had constructed parts to be made into lanterns earlier that day, and he instructed everyone to grab the lantern pieces and head to the campfire near the northeastern coal hills. The lanterns slowly ascended into the clear night sky. The new refugee remarked on how serene their teeny community seemed. Most of the squires chuckled, and Madzi chimed in. She said they had to work like hell to get this far, and nearly starved just weeks ago. Tangier nodded, but then explained that they had plenty of food now for an extra mouth to feed, and he needn't worry about being turned away. The first day of spring was still bitterly cold, far too cold to start farming outdoors. As soon as the frost receded, Megahoof would share his knowledge and plan for a beautiful garden brimming with a variety of food. The newest member asked what the worst chore the community had. It was an obvious gesture to say that he wanted to help them as much as he could. Lazarus mentioned he had started to clear the battlefield to the west, and the new refugee promptly set out to task. This day, the squires had gained 2 members, a fellow adlet and a young bison calf as well. With grit, determination, and a high tolerance for grotesque grunt work, the battlefield had finally been cleared. It was easy to forget that Madzi was suffering from digestive issues as a result of the pollution and smog, because she never complained. Whenever she rested, Sappo would check in on her, administering herbal medicine in hopes that it would alleviate her symptoms. With Bash, the illness was a lot more obvious to see. He visibly suffered from malnutrition as he struggled to keep his food down. Megahoof and Judea knew that Bash was in good hands. They managed to sleep through most nights, as Sappo was happy to wake and check in on Bash throughout the night. The experiment with the tree farm had worked, and the Adlets had managed to farm the area. But with the new revelation about the rolling cycles of polluting smog, they would have to convert the tree farm back into a pollution waste dump. The 2 southern trees could not absorb the amount of pollution the smog and the Adlets generated. A 3rd tree was required, and even then, it might not be enough. Most of the main farm had been harvested, but now the Adlets had a new and very humorous problem. They had thousands of mushrooms and nowhere to store them, or to make sure they didn't rot in the summer heat. This, however, was a pretty good problem to have versus the starvation they faced just a few weeks previous. Lazarus and Sappho came up with the idea to utilize other steam geysers in the Bison Glade to keep Nutrifungus fields growing year-round. Megahoof thought it was a great idea, but shared his concern that they wouldn't be able to cope with the amount of pollution it generated. He'd have to do some research and get back to them. Hauling the Nutrifungus to the storeroom shelves would be quite the undertaking. Working in the dark was difficult, and the adlets kept tracking in dirt into the keep from the fields. Megahoof made note of the inefficiency to be addressed later. Judea chatted with Arauco about the village he had left behind. Arauco told her that his community lived in a giant dark forest and built a network of tree houses to hide from the visitors. They would execute raids on encampments and metallic facilities using stealth, subterfuge, and guile. For multiple generations, raiding was his community's tradition, until a new wave of metallic behemoths entered his forest and burned it all to ash. Arauco managed to hide in an underground aquifer cave. He returned to his home when the coast was clear, only to realize he was likely the sole survivor. He foraged what little food he could and searched for refuge. Megahoof suggested that everyone should try to clean around the perimeter of the keep, hoping to build up a bit of a buffer for when the smogs rolled back in. He knew that cleaning the pollution was a dreary task, but hoped this new strategy could keep the blight at bay. What little hay grass in the bison pastures that hadn't been eaten, trampled, frozen, or blighted still succumbed to disease. This new disease would have to be tended to by one of the two farmers before it could spread to the neighboring crop. Megahoof woke Sappho, apologized, and asked him to tend to the hay in the pasture. Sappho looked confused, and Megahoof said if the situation was obvious to him, Sappho would easily understand once he went outside. Sappho's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he knew immediately that he had some blight to cut. He returned back to bed and thanked Megahoof for noticing early enough to save almost all of the heal root. The farmers decided between crop cycles to try their new axes on the ashen trees in the Bison Glade, hoping to increase their supply of raw wood for tanning liquors, timber, and fuel. The trees yielded very little wood, but it helped to pass the time. Sections of rich soil were identified underneath the deep pollution. And this would be a good area to try to clean first, as the soils here would be able to accommodate plant growth faster than anywhere else. Judea had a bit of an inspiration and asked Megahoof, might it be possible to train a bird to go contact their coastal community? It was time to let them know that they were thriving out here in the Bison Glade, that they hadn't perished like so many of the previous hunting parties. Felling the ashen trees was simple work. The wood was dry, as if aged for splitting. The sounds of falling trees echoed throughout the glade. The shelves designated for food storage was overflowing. Judea knew she'd have to build a dedicated pantry. The northern door next to the kitchen would be the perfect location. Many hands make short work of urgent tasks, and many hands indeed help to construct the pantry. The temperature of the Bison Glades started to warm up. Soon Megahoof would be able to share his dream of wheat fields and fruit tree groves, but how the Adlets would cope with the pollution was still a bit of a mystery. Megahoof hoped to start off small with a modest field and grove, while he unlocked the mystery of the strange pollution-absorbing trees. Megahoof had saved seeds and books about farming techniques for this exact situation. He envisioned a future where little girls like Madzi could play freely in the fields and forests, instead of shoveling polluted topsoil into burlap sacks late into the twilight hours of the night. Thank you for watching episode 8 of Hedge Knights Fungus Festival. If you would like to support the channel, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing this content with your friends, or even becoming one of my Patreon patrons. Links can be found in the description of the video. If you would like to join my gaming community, Rhadamant.com or the description of this video have a link to Discord as well. Thank you so very much for watching. I'll catch you next episode. Farewell, my fellow Adlet.